Hello, and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alastair.
And this fortnight, we're talking about hotly tipped Oscar buzz movie La La Land, the new adaptation of a series of unfortunate events from Netflix, the new Dropkick Murphys album, 11 Short Stories of Pain and Glory, and my recommendation from last time, the somewhat topically relevant Richard III movie, directed by Richard Loncraine and starring Ian McKellen, and invoking not a small amount of Nazi imagery. But before all that, in the last couple of weeks, I have been, shockingly enough, reading a comic. I have also read some books, or a book, but it's a very long book, so I can't yet talk about it here, because I'm only about a third of the way through it. But yes, the comic I've read has been Miracleman, an early 80s superhero deconstruction comic, which has the honour of being one of the first the big successful superhero deconstruction things, I think. This is Alan Moore at the beginning of his career, pre-Watchmen Alan Moore, taking a character from decades before that, who was Miracleman, or I think he may have also been Marvel Man. The character's name has changed due to various legal wranglings involving the company Marvel not wanting someone else to publish a character called Marvel Man. So Miracleman was started in the 80s and brought the character back in a sort of dark, gritty scenario in which the guy who used to be Miracleman is now middle-aged, and then his superhero persona suddenly re-emerges, and he has to grapple with how this affects his new adult life. Because the original premise of Miracleman was that, / Marvelman, was that it was a kid who would say his magic word, which was Kibota, which is atomic backwards, because it was the mid-20th century and every superhero relates to nuclear power in some way. And then he becomes this sort of adult superhero. But now, the secret identity, Michael Moran, who was a kid, is now middle-aged. So, when he says Kibota, he actually becomes a younger, more attractive man than he currently is. And then there's some issues with how he relates to his wife and stuff. There's the re-emergence of some old villains in new, slightly more disturbing forms. It's a very well-renowned work. I've now read the first volume of the 3 Alan Moore books that have now been published. It was out of print for years, I think, possibly even decades, actual decades, due to various legal wranglings because the company that published it went bust. But Marvel, even though it used to be called Marvel Man, have spent what I think is quite a lot of money clearing up the legal situation and republishing it. Alan Moore, who always be relied on to have a slightly strange attitude to his own old work, insisted that it could be republished, but only if he was credited as the original writer, rather than Alan Moore. So, okay, whatever you like, Alan, whatever makes you happy.
It sounds like a very interesting premise. Things kind of deconstructing superheroes are quite sort of popular now. I mean, you've got things like, The Incredibles, like what if superheroes had to have like an ordinary family life, or I don't know, things like Deadpool that are like much more self-aware. But is this kind of where all those ideas sort of began?
Well, I mean, the most famous sort of deconstruction of superheroes and sort of, what would this really involve? Is this really a good idea? Is Watchmen. And that obviously was Alan Moore again. So yeah, it's one of these works which is sort of the old sort of classic version of this idea that has now become quite widespread. So it sort of feels retrospectively kind of predictable. But of course, in the early 80s, it would have been, like, actually this comic, I think at least the first year or so of Miracleman came out before I was born, would have been pretty revelatory, I think. Yes, it's one of those works. It still feels quite sort of raw, I think. There's something slightly uncomfortable about it. You can sort of feel that it's going into slightly unfamiliar territory. It's in these quite expensive hardback volumes, which I found on a sale at the back table of a comic shop. Because otherwise, to be honest, possibly to justify the huge amount of money they spent on clarifying the legal situation, the one thing Marvel haven't done is republish Miracleman in a particularly affordable, accessible format. I did only buy them because these hardbacks, which are meant to cost about £16 to £20 each, I found for about £6 each on a random sale table.
It's possible that this is a very influential work in comics, but not particularly well known. So as it's an item that appeals to kind of enthusiasts and collectors, they probably want like a presentation edition that's kind of, nicely done, nicely produced with sort of hardbacks and glossy imagery. It's not the sort of thing that maybe would, like, I don't know, appeal to the casual fan who wants digital downloads or just sort of cheap print copies.
To be fair to Marvel, there are also digital downloads, but yeah, it is a quite, I don't know, I mean, until a few years ago when Marvel republished these new editions, it was a sort of a slightly legendary work, this sort of lost masterpiece that you could basically only get by either torrenting it or going hunting on eBay for like the incredibly old out-of-print collected editions. So it does have a certain legendary status, so it is interesting to finally get to read it after all these years. There was also, the series continued after Alan Moore left with Neil Gaiman writing it, so it certainly started off some big careers.
Oh, cool. Sounds very interesting.
It is an interesting one, yeah. I mean, if anyone's interested, there are quite a lot of lengthy write-ups on the internet explaining the incredibly long legal wranglings about who owns Miracleman. I think at some point Todd McFarlane of Spawn thought he owns Miracleman, but turned out not to, and then Neil Gaiman had to swap him the rights for another character to get the rights back. It's a bit sort of comics inside gossip, but it is quite interesting in its way. Anyway, what have you been up to in the last 2 glorious weeks?
Well, I've been looking at BAFTA and Oscar nominations. So the Oscar nominations were announced on the 24th of January, and by the time you listen to this episode, you'll be a mere 8 to 10 days from the BAFTA awards being handed out on the 12th of February. So yeah, this is obviously the kind of the awards season. It's when careers can be made. It's where like sort of obscure movies can kind of rise to prominence. Yeah, for example, the Coen brothers, I guess, probably own a lot of their mainstream success to the fact that Fargo won an Oscar for, I think, Best Screenplay, and Frances McDormand won an Oscar for Best Actress, beating out a lot of sort of high-profile, big Hollywood movies, and it brought them to fame. It's an interesting time of year. It's always interesting to see what specifically type of films Hollywood wants to reward. Obviously, a lot of films get released towards the end of each year. They come through the festival circuit, and also a lot of them just released by the big studios that are all kind of aiming to pick up Oscar buzz and ultimately pick up awards, which can translate into sort of more DVD sales. I think recently as in the last 10, 15 years, the Oscars have become more important because Hollywood makes a lot of its money from like DVD sales and now digital downloads and streaming and stuff. So picking up lots of awards, can be hugely lucrative, because if you can slap kind of winner of 6 Academy Awards on the front of your DVD, then I think more people are likely to buy it.
Plus, even more cynically, it's one of the main remaining ways you can get people to see a film that isn't part of some mega franchise.
Yeah, that is pretty much it. This is the kind of brief period of the year when things aren't sort of sequels, remakes, adaptations. So yeah, but it's interesting because a lot of films get released and there's a lot of buzz, but it's always interesting to see which ones actually get nominated. As usual, especially when the Oscars were nominations were handed out, a few people in the UK were a bit like, what? Because obviously some of the films nominated haven't been released here yet, or even we haven't heard much about. But it was interesting to see what was recognised. The big story is that La La Land has a record-breaking number of nominations. Is it 14 or 16?
Has it broken the record or equaled the record? I can't remember.
It's equaled the record. No, it's equaled the record, that's it.
But yeah, La La Land was, I think, expected to do well and has. Outside of that, our attempts to see films that might do well in the Oscars have been mixed. Arrival's done all right for itself, considering it's a sci-fi film, and those aren't traditionally that successful in these awards.
I think Arrival's got a few nominations. It was nominated for Best Cinematography.
And Best Picture.
And Best Picture, yeah. I think Amy Adams, quite sadly, wasn't nominated for Best Actress, although she was nominated at the BAFTAs. A lot of people have speculated that it's possible that Amy Adams may have ended up with a split ticket situation, in that a lot of people thought she deserved at least a nomination, but because she had 2 high-profile films last year, Arrival and Nocturnal Animals, her fans or supporters may have voted for one or the other, but not both, which is maybe what kept her out of the nominations. Or it could be just prejudice against science fiction films.
Nocturnal Animals wasn't sci-fi, was it?
No, it was a thriller. Yeah, in kind of the hierarchy of what's recognised as worthy and not worthy, I think thrillers sit above science fiction, but below historical fiction and biopics. I think biopics usually sit right at the top. One of the interesting things is a lot more diverse this year than last year. If you remember last year, we had the hashtag #OscarsSoWhite, and I don't think there were many people of colour nominated in... Is it none of the major awards, or...?
Certainly most of the acting and directing categories were, I think, pretty heavily swept by white people.
Just glancing down the list of 2016 nominees, I think the 6 biggest categories didn't nominate anyone who wasn't white. For example, Best Actor, it's Bryan Cranston, Matt Damon, Leonardo DiCaprio, Michael Fassbender, Eddie Redmayne. So it is good that this year is more diverse. Fences, starring and directed by Denzel Washington, has been nominated. Hidden Figures, about a group of African-American women who worked for NASA in the early days of the space program.
Yeah, Ruth Negga has been nominated for Best Actress, and although I haven't seen Loving, the film she's actually nominated for, she was very good in Preacher, and also not bad in a quite small role in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So, yeah, it's good to see her up there.
What's interesting also is that how badly we managed to predict what was going to get nominated.
I mean, we did quite a half-assed job of it. We saw about 2 films. But yeah, we saw Birth of a Nation, which has not done well at all. Despite the slight push for diversity, they've managed to find diverse films to reward without giving anything to Birth of a Nation.
Silence, Martin Scorsese's epic that we covered 2 episodes ago. Again...
Yeah, largely ignored, yeah. There's Best Cinematography, I think, and is that it? I mean, we did sort of agree when we were talking about it that was a decent but quite flawed film, so I'm not necessarily going to choose that as my hill to die on for things that should have had awards. I preferred Amy Adams to get a nomination before I preferred Silence to get a nomination, to be honest.
Yeah. Snowden, which I saw at the London Film Festival, and I thought it was quite good, didn't pick up any awards or nominations for Oliver Stone's biopic of Edward Snowden. And usually biopics you expect to do quite well, but this time not so much. So far of the main nominees, I've only seen La La Land. I'm hoping before the Oscars come out, I'll have time to see some of the others.
Yeah, I saw the trailer for Gold about 3 or 4 times while seeing films recently, and that makes me want to see it less every time I see it. So I can't say I'm that surprised that seems to have picked up jack shit.
Yeah, there's always some films that kind of are released around the same time and generally don't resonate.
It did look like it wanted an Oscar to an extent that was always kind of off-putting.
Yeah, there is such a thing as trying too hard. I mean, La La Land isn't a particularly Oscar-y film, but seems to have picked up lots of nominations, maybe because it's different, or maybe because it's about Hollywood, and Hollywood likes films about Hollywood, but I'm sure there's plenty to discuss on that topic in a bit.
Yes, we'll be discussing La La Land in about 10 seconds, I imagine. But yeah, Girl with All the Gifts picked up a BAFTA for debut by a British writer, director or producer, which is, nice.
Yeah, so good. Mike Carey's got a nomination.
Yep, and Camille Gattin, the producer, as well. Also, on a related note, they finally released the soundtrack, which I have now bought. It's very good.
Oh, excellent. I should get that.
It's exactly the sort of vocal screeching you'd expect. But yeah, I finished writing a thing I was working on yesterday, which did the sweet yelling sound of the Girl with All the Gifts soundtrack. It's on iTunes, I think, or you can get it at mondotees.bandcamp.com. But yeah, if you like sort of shrieking vocal noises, it's a very good soundtrack by Christabel Tapia DeVere. Check it out.
First up this week, we will be discussing multiple Golden Globe winner and Oscar-nominated film La La Land. Set in Los Angeles, La La Land is a musical about the romance between Mia, Emma Stone, and Seb, Ryan Gosling, following them as they meet, fall in love, and trying to follow their dreams of being an actress and a jazz musician. There's a lot of excitement around this film, as we've just said. It might win many Oscars. But Nick, what did you think of the film?
Yes, it was very good. I don't think it's controversial to say it was pretty good. It's the sort of classic concept versus execution thing. I mean, do you want to watch a sort of smooth, charming Hollywood musical / rom-com with Emma Stone and Ryan Gosling? If so, it's a very good form of it. There's enough sort of charm and a bit of genuine pathos and some parts which aren't completely predictable to make it, rise above the standard tropes of that. At the same time, it's not raising many eyebrows or breaking many moulds, but yeah, both of the main actors are very, very charismatic. The general look of it is lovely. There's lots of sort of bright colours and spinning shots of Hollywood. It's a good film. It's a very nice, pleasant, warm bath of a film. And in the depressing news climate we're currently in, I can perhaps see why everyone's flocked to the cinema to immerse themselves in a really good feel-good film, rather than stay at home and look at Twitter and wish they could launch themselves into space.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head when you say it's sort of an escapist film, in that even though it's set sort of present-day Los Angeles, it is very much a film that's kind of, as well as being a musical that has sort of like fantastical or sort of magical realist elements to it. It's quite like an old-fashioned film. It's sort of very sort of aware of the history of some musicals. The people who wrote the music said that they were like big fans of kind of the studio era Hollywood musicals and the Fred Alastair and Ginger Roberts musicals. So they really were like influenced by that a lot. And I think you can tell in this film, because it really has a nostalgia for old Hollywood, sort of Hollywood of the 40s and 50s. You can tell there's a lot of references to old films. There's a bit when Mia, who works in a coffee shop, points out, and her coffee shop's on the Warner Brothers sort of studio lot, that the window from Casablanca is sort of opposite where she works. I mean, there's a lot of like old jazz in the film that is kind of, again, evocative of the 40s and 50s in Hollywood. And it's just kind of, in the iconography of the film, there's lots of old-fashioned references. Like, it begins by saying presented in CinemaScope, and then like the screen kind of expands to its full size, because it used to be like a a selling point of films, that these kind of big lavish musicals, that they would shoot them in Technicolor, and they'd shoot them in this kind of wider format that is now pretty much standard. But the fact they put, like old films used to say, like presented in CinemaScope, they put that at the beginning of the film as a reference to the films that it's sort of paying homage to. The typeface he uses for like the credits, the title, and the film's divided into like seasons, so whenever like a season comes up, it uses this very sort of typeface that's evocative of the old studio system.
Yeah, I mean, the jazz element was quite fun as well, if only because it, again, jerks it just far enough away from being a completely standard Hollywood film about Hollywood mythologizing Hollywood. It makes the fact that Ryan Gosling's character is this jazz enthusiast and pianist and aspiring jazz club owner is at least something more interesting than just actor fucks actor. I know that there's been a bit of talk about the bits where he explains jazz to the Emma Stone character as to whether it's basically patronising mansplaining. That's basically the argument. Is it an endearing level of geekery or patronising mansplaining? It's sort of straddling the line. It just about works for me, but I'm not going to tell anyone else. It has to work for them.
I think it does at points come across as a bit patronising, but it's also in the same way that a lot of people who are really passionate about something do come across sometimes as patronising, especially to people who don't really understand the thing they're really passionate about. I probably have done this myself in my life. So I think the scene came across as both a realistic portrayal of someone who's really passionate about something and really wants to talk about it, but also came across as someone being sort of patronising and mansplaining. So,
yeah, but that's the thing. I think he is arguably doing that, but I think he's not necessarily doing it in a particularly dickish way. It's, as is the case in these films, the important part is the characters are basically likeable most of the time, and that's what it mostly just about hits. I mean, the fact that he's actually passionate about something other than the plot of the film, I don't know, it does, again, elevate it slightly, because a lot of these films, it seems like the characters basically have no life outside the film, or the story they're in. Yeah,
they seem like three-dimensional, real human beings, and because the main plot of the film is how their interests and life sort of outside of their relationship kind of pulls on the relationship. So, they meet and fall in love, and then they struggle because they want to have a life, not a life outside each other, but they have other interests and other things going on that are kind of put pressure on the relationship. So in that sense, I really thought it was a quite accurate portrayal of, so the pressures that like kind of young couples go through.
But yeah, that was the part that was a bit sort of rom-com-y, isn't it? Because that's what most rom-coms are, sort of couple meets, they fall in love, they drift along in a bubble for a while, and then eventually real life or the real pressures of the other things they want to do with themselves start to put pressure on the relationship, and then drama ensues. And yeah, there was, I don't know, there's part of which it was a rom-com as much as it was a musical. I mean, there was definitely a long period in like the second half of the film where there weren't that many songs until Emma Stone's big final ballad.
Yeah, it's not a musical in that, like a lot of stage musicals, which are kind of entirely told through song, in that it has songs in it, and the songs are used to like advance the plot.
The songs are there in a sort of standard West End musical sense, in that the characters just burst into song to illustrate their feelings or whatever. It's just that there seems to be quite a long gap between the songs. But as I say, especially in the second half of the film, there's not that many at all. I think most West End musicals have dialogue. I mean, in terms of being told entirely through music, I think you're thinking of opera.
There's musicals like We Will Rock You or Les Miserables, which are pretty much entirely songs. But yeah, you're right that this film does, it has long bits that aren't songs, so it is also like has elements that are sort of a romantic drama or romantic comedy, in that there's a lot of bits that are just about how the characters interact in, I don't know, you want to say a more realist setting? I suppose if you said this film was magical realism, then I guess the magical bit is when everyone sort of bursts into song and starts singing and is well choreographed, and I guess the realist bits are the kind of bits that to drive the plot forward, which are much more reminiscent of like our world, when they go to see a film together, or they bump into each other at a party, and it's sort of slightly awkward in the early stages of their relationship.
I was kind of disappointed there weren't more sort of super memorable songs. Maybe I was hoping there would be more sort of catchy songs to blow me away. Although the ballad at the end, which I mentioned, was very, very nice. And there was the sort of this recurring sort of City of Stars riff that was quite sweet. But yeah, I don't know, maybe it's not a sort of musical that has sort of big catchy pop songs, I don't know.
I really like the songs, actually. I just really enjoyed them. I really like this, the one which is Waste of a Beautiful Evening, after, I think, the party when they sort of first start to fall in love, and they're kind of walking across the Hollywood Hills and see Los Angeles lit up, and it's very beautiful. I thought that was, there's a song they sing then. I think the dance from that is the one that's ended up on the poster.
The iconic bit where they're sort of
Tap dancing.
Tap dancing with each other at the top of a hill, yeah.
Yeah, I really like that song. And I really like there's the opening song, which is Another Day of Sun, when everyone in a traffic jam bursts into sort of dancing on top of their cars. That was really good. One I think is called Mia's Song, her audition ballad towards the end of the film was very good.
Yes, that was good. Although someone in the cinema nearly kept laughing at it, which was off-putting. But it's hardly my fault they have no soul. Yeah, I mean, the slightly maudlin sort of, Hollywood, it'll punch your balls. That sort of theme is, in its way, quite played out, but I can't say it didn't work in this particular film while I was watching it.
Yeah. I mean, it's an emotional film, and I know a lot of people talked about how much they cried during it and things like that, and it is an emotional film about serious things, like the tension between doing what you want to do or following your dream, in inverted commas, and having a kind of comfortable, pleasant life is a thing that a lot of people have to face to a greater or lesser degree. And they approach it with a real sense of emotional complexity. You know, whenever there's a fight between Seb and Mia, it was never like one person's right, one person's wrong. It's very much you can see where both of them are coming from, and you can see the tensions in the relationship, which makes it more emotional. It's kind of like, well, when you see a fight in a film or a TV show or something like that, you just realise, when as an audience you think this is what you both need to do to sort this out. But in this film, I was very much like, these tensions are somewhat irresolvable. There are problems in that they both got things they want to do that are pulling on their lives, and sometimes they pull them together and sometimes they pull them apart, and it's got that degree of emotional complexity that I felt was quite realistic.
Yeah, it's not like the bits you get in, I don't know, Flash and Arrow every fucking week, to be honest, where someone decides to create tension by just not telling someone else something for no real reason except to create a sense of betrayal when they eventually find out. You know, the problems they have do grow out of the characters, but they're in character to the extent that they can have them have these arguments later on without needing to, push one of them into acting like a dick, even though it doesn't really seem right.
I think what also makes these scenes we're discussing so powerful is the performances are really, really good. Like Emma Stone, especially as Mia, I thought really, excellent performance, great singing, dancing, really conveyed the essence of this character. You really felt, there's a bit when she's staging her own one-woman play, and there's a real sense of tension that, like, the film isn't sort of saccharine enough that everything that she does is, that everything she does is going to go really well. So there's a real sense of tension of, she's staging this play, will it go well, will it not go well? But you really want it to go well for her because you're really invested in the character. And I think that is down to Emma Stone's performance. Ryan Gosling, also really good. He brought a lot of humanity towards quite a difficult character. Characters who are incredibly invested in one thing to the exclusion of all else can sometimes come across as, a bit of a dick or just sort of self-obsessed, and he managed to make this into a believable human being. And the two together had excellent chemistry, singing and dancing and acting.
Yes. Also, I enjoyed the cameo from J.K. Simmons. He's always fun.
Yeah, that was nice.
I've loved him since he was J. Jonah Jameson in the Spider-Man films, but it's always good to see him pop up in anything, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's a very safe, standard film in its way, so it depends, ultimately, whether you feel that we should be focusing more on very good executions of very sort of safe concepts, or whether it's Hollywood should be focusing more on rewarding things that are a bit more difficult or diverse or politically challenging or whatever. But I can't say this isn't a good execution of its type.
It's certainly very well made, and everyone who worked on it did a really good job and deserves the recognition that they're getting. Obviously, there's ways it could be more challenging. I mean, Hollywood can make a film about people of colour, sort of writing and performing jazz, and that would be probably a bit more radical.
It is true. They have got a character who represents jazz and is a white guy, even though jazz is obviously an art which came out of the black community in New Orleans. So, yeah, there is that.
There is that, definitely. But hopefully this will inspire, the success of this film will inspire people to maybe do something a bit more radical and Hollywood to be a bit less risk-averse about this. The other way in which I think it is certainly different and unusual and a bit risky is that the musical is not a popular genre in film right now. I mean, maybe it's due a comeback, but the 40s and 50s genres, a lot of them are pretty dead. We don't get very many of them. We don't get many musicals anymore. We don't get many westerns anymore. We don't make screwball comedies anymore. We don't get really melodramas anymore.
This hasn't exactly... I mean, obviously, again, it's good, I like it, but I don't think it's, dragged the musical kicking and screaming into the 21st century, has it? It's not saying, here is a way we could do modern musicals. It's saying, here's a classic musical in the old style, oh, the good old days.
Yeah, but I felt that that in itself was a was unusual in the fact I was really surprised by how much of a traditional musical this film was. I mean, a lot of films we've seen recently have been kind of ironic sort of takes on musicals, like they either been like jukebox musicals, that are kind of,
Glee. You mean Glee?
Glee, or things like that film that Clint Eastwood made about Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. What was it called? That doesn't matter. Okay, but in that that came out recently, or like a couple of years ago. I mean, there's other sort of jukebox musicals that are kind of like, again, trying to update and change the musical. So kind of by bringing in like popular songs or trying to do musicals in a somewhat like ironic or postmodern way, which this is very much sort of returned to a classic way of doing musicals, or an older way of doing musicals, like writing original songs and performing them. I was surprised how much it was like a classic musical and not in any way an attempt to be like a modern incarnation of a musical.
But the fact that it is so heavily a sort of a misty-eyed look back at the old musicals doesn't help with the idea that it's a bit of a sort of safe conservative film.
Yeah, but I thought that Hollywood had lost its appetite for traditional musicals, and that people would only do musicals if you could find a way to make them more modern. And I was surprised by how little they'd actually tried to modernize the genre for this film. I mean, you could say that's safe in the sense that they're just trying to recreate something in the past that's been successful rather than taking it in a new direction. But as something that's fallen out of favour so massively, trying to bring it back is, I guess, a bit of a risk.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to see if this does capture some sort of revival of musicals and other people now take it in a more modern direction. I don't know. I suspect this will just be, a unique sort of nostalgia piece by one guy, and then it'll just sort of fade away again.
Well, I see. Maybe we'll get Drum and Bass, the musical.
I mean, I wouldn't be able to tell if they'd written the original drum and bass songs for that musical.
Look away, look away, look away, look away. The show will wreck your evening, your whole life and your day. Every single episode is nothing but dismay. So look away, look away, look away.
Okay, next we're going to talk about a series of unfortunate events. The new Netflix adaptation of the series of children's novels written by Lemony Snicket. There are 13 books. This series covers the first 4 books in the form of 4 two-parters, so 8 episodes in total, if you don't want to do the maths yourself. And yes, this stars Neil Patrick Harris as the villain Count Olaf, and Patrick Warburton as the on-screen presence of Lemony Snicket, who of course is in real life the author Daniel Handler, and stars Melina Weissman, Louis Hines and Presley Smith as the 3 orphaned Baudelaires, who find themselves, orphaned after their family home burns down with their parents in it, or apparently in it. It's a bit of a mystery show, so it could go either way. But they seem to be orphaned, and they're shunted off to a guardian, Count Olaf, the Neil Patrick Harris character, who is trying to steal their fortune by basically clinging onto them till they come of age, it seems. And yes, they escape him, they go on to subsequent guardians in each subsequent book, and then Count Olaf comes after them, determined to steal the fortune. This was a film with Jim Carrey as Count Olaf a few years ago, but that film, I think, produced during the height of the sort of Harry Potter boom, where every studio wanted their own children's book series to adapt. Didn't do amazingly well, so they didn't make the other 12 films in the series, which would have been quite an endeavour. So here we are in a TV show. This one seems to have a lot more involvement from the author, so he seems to have given this one his seal of approval, whereas I gather the original film, he did a draft and then he was sort of replaced by someone else.
The original film wasn't very good. I did see it in the cinema.
There is also that. I saw it in the cinema as well. It was kind of lame. Before we even get into heavy reviewing, I think we can safely say this is better than the original film. Well, the previous film adaptation, rather. So, anyway, Alastair, what did you think of it?
Yeah, I really like this. Really good TV show. The tone of sort of dark comedy, with the emphasis on the dark that's kind of spun throughout the whole thing, is what I really enjoyed about it the most. The kind of sense of like, oh, this is the most tragic story that has ever been told, and the suffering of the Baudelaire orphans that never ends. Nothing good will ever come into their life, and everything is horror and misery. It opens with this song they've written for it that kind of just goes, look away, look away. You get that before you get even anything else when you watch the first episode, and it sets the tone perfectly. It's just dark and foreboding in a kind of over-the-top, really like melodramatic way, but it's also sort of funny. Yeah, because it just really nails that kind of dark comedy by taking the kind of sense of awfulness and pushing it up to the max. And like this, sort of the Baudelaire kids, the 3 actors for playing the parts just look miserable the entire time. Always just their eyes kind of like cast down and sort of with a sense of resignation that everything would just be horrible and their parents are dead and life is just basically a never-ending torment. So it's just so over the top, it's just really, really funny.
Yeah, I'd agree with you on the tone. I felt the plot could have used some titling a bit, but the tone, yes. I found myself weirdly reminded of when we were talking about Sherlock in the last couple of episodes. There's a lot of like aspects of this which I really like the sort of the gothic aesthetic, the sort of the constant sort of tongue-in-cheek doom and gloom, the smug better jokes where they wink to the camera about the fact they're on Netflix, the big hammy villain performance by Neil Patrick Harris, who's clearly having a wonderful time, the narrator turning up within the story and commenting on it, the big conspiracy story that they're slowly unravelling, and, you know, they're not just sort of tokenly there either, they're all done pretty well. You know, they've clearly, as with all Netflix shows, somehow they've managed to throw a huge amount of money at this. It all looks really good, and they've got this sort of weird Tim Burton for kids vibe going on, and it's pretty good. But yeah, I did find the actual plot a bit slightly slow though. I don't know, it just always seemed like everyone was sort of trudging from plot point to plot point in quite a non-urgent way. Like, much as I enjoy Lemony Snicket's sort of interjections, it did only serve to slow things down even further.
I guess it's the element of they're turning 4 books into 8 TV episodes, and they are quite short books.
They are, yes. I've read one of them ages and ages and ages ago, and if I don't pretend to have like enough recollection to go full critic on it, I do remember it being quite short.
Yeah, the Lemony Snicket film with Jim Carrey took the first 3 and crammed them into about an hour and a half, and it was really too rushed. This one maybe has gone for the opposite approach, which is possibly a bit too slow, in that the kind of turning each book into 2 episodes means, I guess, the plot can move quite slowly. But I guess it gives it more time to indulge this sort of maudlin sense of gloom.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, a lot of the sort of the stylistic touches are fun. I just occasionally found myself willing for a bit more to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, the Baudelaires, as you said, they sort of have this sort of downbeat, dejected thing going on, which is in keeping with their role as sad orphans in a sad sort of massive gothic melodrama, but it didn't necessarily make them the most interesting thing to stare at for 8 hours. I mean, I guess that's why the Neil Patrick Harris character is there, to be a bit more of a explodey, quippy presence to compensate for the fact that the other main characters are these 3 sad orphans.
He is really good in this, and all the different performances, because his character, the villain, Count Olaf, is an actor who's constantly disguising himself as different people to sneak up close to and capture the Baudelaire orphans. And it is amazing how Neil Patrick Harris inhabits all these different sort of characters that his character is pretending to be, and always has, you know, the Count Olaf is always coming through in the performances that Count Olaf is putting on. If you get what I sense, there's kind of layers of performance going on here, because there's performances within Neil Patrick Harris's performance, and he is really good, and is just really funny and delivers some very witty lines with real snap and pizzazz.
Yeah, it possibly didn't help that the middle 2 stories were a bit sort of similar. They meet a sort of well-meaning Guardian. The Guardian is fooled by a Count Olaf disguise. Hijinks.
Yeah.
I quite like the 4th one, though. The 4th one sort of mixed things up a bit.
Yeah, one that was set in a mill. There was a sort of, again, a conspiracy involving an optician. I thought that was really good. There's a real sense of mystery and tension. As you said, there's a kind of big conspiracy that's woven throughout the whole thing that they slowly peel back, that adds to the kind of sense of a mystery that you're kind of progressing through, so the audience feels rewarded that the plot is moving somewhere and is moving forwards. It's not just going around in the same kind of circular pattern 3 or 4 times throughout the series.
Hopefully it'll perk up. I mean, I just in practice found myself occasionally clock watching during some of the slower episodes. I mean, maybe they could have done like 1 hour or like 2 half hours per book instead of 2 like 50 minutes. I don't know.
Well, as we said, the thing about Netflix is that they do and should experiment more with length. Like, the OA episodes varied from, like, an hour to, like, half an hour. So maybe they should have done that a bit more with this. Maybe had some of them been... They don't all have to be 47 minutes, which I think they all were.
There was some degree of stretching, I think. I think they ranged from about 43 minutes to about 62 or 63. So there is a bit of variation in there. I don't know. I mean, it's one of these things where, yeah, it's a fun thing to sort of casually watch and sort of smirk at. The wordplay is quite fun. They quite enjoy sort of taking a word and turning it inside out through constant repetition. There's a lot of that. Lemony Snicket himself was good. I mean, yeah, there's a part of me that always wished he'd be on it more, or that they'd had at least one slightly more charismatic hero. Like, you know, I mean, it's not uncommon for heroes to be the least interesting hero. Like, the main hero is often the sort of the staunch, boring one. I mean, Buffy Summers, God bless her, is not the most interesting hero in Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Or Harry Potter himself.
Or Harry Potter in Harry Potter, exactly. In this sort of series, it's quite common for the hero to be a sort of staunch hero, and the other supporting characters to get to be slightly more more interesting or funny. I just felt like all the the two Baudelaires who were, a baby, were both sort of staunch and standard. It's possible it could have been annoying if one had been overly quippy, but I felt they could have maybe made one of them a bit more, I don't know, I felt like there could have been a bit more interesting interplay between them instead of them both being these sort of downtrodden, obedient children.
Yeah.
But I don't know. At this point, I'm probably saying change the original books, because I'm pretty sure they were like that in the original books as well. And obviously, this is an adaptation that the author has worked on and is very much true to his original vision. So it's possible that I'm wanting a change that just isn't ever going to happen.
Yeah, there's a wonderful sense of oddness woven throughout the whole show, which I really like. It's just like kind of put together like differently than a lot of TV shows. Like the characters are a bit more absurd, the situations are darker or stranger, and like even just like the way it's shot and the way the dialogue is formulated is quite different in order to bring out this, like I say, this sort of over-the-top sense of the tragedy of the whole thing. I thought it was quite indebted to the films of Wes Anderson, who, again, has this sense of, like, everything's kind of put together in a slightly strange way, and the camera shots aren't sort of the ones normally used, and the characters are very over-the-top. Also, the Coen brothers as well go in for this. So a lot of kind of American independent filmmakers, they have these like over the top characters that are unusual and sort of eccentric, which was pretty much every character in A Series of Unfortunate Events. Consciously stylistic, I think is what I'm trying to say, is that rather than when most things are kind of shot in a straightforward way to be believable representations of our world, these were consciously stylized representations of a world that's similar to our world, but very different. It's deliberately non-conventional. There's also elements of the Coen brothers and Wes Anderson. They do the same sort of humour through repetition, which there was quite a lot of in A Series of Unfortunate Events. The constant repeating of the various guardians or adult characters telling the Baudelaires like what an unusual word means, and the Baudelaires would always say, we know what that word means. Or sort of Lemony Snicket again, like explaining concepts.
Yeah, but I liked the way that it's sort of committed to this sense of the weird and slightly askew throughout. I mean, a lot of shows or movies I've watched in my life, they start off with this explosion of here's a massively stylized aesthetic to bring in a slightly crap film. As an example, Suicide Squad, I think, started off with quite a clear sort of statement of here's a weird neon aesthetic, and then by about an hour in, it's just a really standard, slightly drab superhero film. Like, all the odd things are still there, but they're sort of trudging them out. Suicide Squad is an extreme example because it's bad, but a lot of stuff sometimes just starts off with this explosion of style, and then unavoidably, once they think they've got your attention, sort of settles down into comparatively dull. And this, I think, did sort of keep the odd narrative moves and the sudden interjections and the weird flips and the strange sort of look of everything pretty much intact from beginning to end. Yeah, in terms of did they maintain their aesthetic, yes, they definitely did, and it is a very good, fun aesthetic to spend time with.
Yeah. Another example is the Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, which the first episode really piles you with the kind of the oddness and the kind of off-the-wall nature of the plot. And then it does kind of settle down into be a bit more traditional mystery plot after that. I mean, there's a lot of strange stuff that happens in that show, and it does maintain the atmosphere as well. But I don't think it does it as well as A Series of Unfortunate Events that kind of really creates this real strong individual tone for the show and kind of maintains it throughout, and is really, really good at getting across the sort of oddness and the stylistic over-the-topness of it. Yeah. I think, the Roald Dahl comparison, I think, is a good one. I think we went through a phase of sort of children's stories or children's books being quite positive in tone. I think, like, Harry Potter is a good one. Example of that. Harry Potter has its dark bits, and he has like lots of setbacks in the plot, but the overall trajectory is pretty much like negative through to positive, and most of the books kind of go through a trajectory of negative to positive, and kind of everything kind of generally works out all right, whereas this kind of brings out that kind of Roald Dahl sense of like bad things happen and nothing good will come of it.
Harry Potter goes through this the standard sort of fantasy hero journey that like Star Wars goes through. It's like initial victory, massive setback, bigger victory.
Yeah, whereas this kind of, every transition seems to be from like negative to negative. Everything steps down. And there's also a real sense of like, which Roald Dahl has well, children entering an adult world, in that bad things have happened to you and the adults don't have the answers and they can't help you out, and you have to kind of figure out how you're going to live by yourself. Whereas I always felt like, say in Harry Potter, there's a kind of comforting blanket of like Dumbledore knows what's really going on and he'll always be there to help you out when you need it. Until obviously the point he dies, but
again, that's a trope, isn't it? The death of the mentor to signify that the hero's now on their own. Yeah,
whereas the death of the mentor is sort of like the first scene of A Series of Unfortunate Events. I like that sort of darker tone, the sense that you're kind of lost in a chaotic world and there's nothing to cling on to. Next, we will be discussing 11 short stories of Pain and Glory, the 9th studio album from the Dropkick Murphys. For those of you who do not know, Massachusetts' premier hardcore punk folk crossover band, they're basically an angrier, heavier, faster, baseball-loving version of the Pogues. Their new album came out recently. Nick, what did you think of it?
Well, I wasn't sure I'd like this, as I said last time when we were talking about the Levelers, I tend to prefer music that shouts rather than outright screams. But after a short adjustment period, yeah, I'm pretty much with it. It's a bit pogsy. It also reminds me a bit of my brief teenage ska phase. We all had one, I stress, we all had one. More than basically anything else. I used to really like the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones. They're also from Boston, so maybe there's something in there, I don't know. Yes, this was quite fun. It was a bit like some of the sillier Pogue songs. There was perhaps a slight lack of incredibly memorable standout tracks. Like the last 3 songs were great. There's a cover of When You Walk Through a Storm, which is good, and again reminds me a bit of ska music, because a big part of ska music seems to be the sort of the raucous ska cover of another song. And then there's the song about the Boston bombings, which is called 4/15/13, just to make it clear that that's what it's about, because that is, of course, the date of that bombing in American dates. And then there's a song called Until the Next Time, which is quite a nice sort of... I for some reason, I always enjoy it when bands finish their albums with an obvious sort of bye-bye song, like Shut Down or Farewell or whatever. So yeah, the last 3 songs especially. And there's a song called Blood, which had a little star next to it on my iTunes download, so I assume that means it's the single or something?
Yeah, I think you've chosen pretty much the highlights of the album, which, sort of found at the end. So the things that I liked the most. The 4/15/13 song I thought was really, really good. Best song on the album. Really emotionally powerful. A great tribute to the people who were sadly lost at the Boston Marathon bombing. But also a great song, just to sort of great uplifting song to listen to any context when you're thinking about loss or about remembering people. That was really good. They seem to do at least one cover per album. Seems to be the kind of the way it works out for Dropkick Murphys. Like their album Blackout has a cover of Fields of Athenry on it. The album Meanest of Times has a cover of The Irish Rover. Well, that might be on one of the actually. But they definitely did one of them had a cover of The Irish Rover on it. So they do like folk songs or sort of other songs. And this time, they did a cover of You Will Never Walk Alone, the song that everyone in the UK associates with Liverpool Football Club. It seems to be their anthem. But it is. I think it's just generally a more sort of songs associated with sport in general. And the Dropkick Murphys are big Red Sox fans. There's a lot of songs on previous albums about the Red Sox. So yeah, those are definitely some of the best bits of the album. I really like this one, Paying My Way. I thought that was a good song. It really reminded me of a Bruce Springsteen song, and I know the Dropkick Murphys are very influenced by Springsteen being another blue-collar American rocker.
That has the sort of chanty bit at the end, doesn't it?
Yeah. Bruce Springsteen collaborated with them on a song on a previous album. The song's called Peg on My Heart. Bruce Springsteen sings on with the Dropkicks. That's a really good song. But yeah, so Paying My Way is another favourite of mine.
Yeah, and First Class Loser was kind of funny. I mean, there's a lot of the songs are sort of fun while you're listening to them, and they're perhaps not stand out memorable, but they're album tracks basically. They're fun enough. Yeah, but I don't know any of the rest of the Dropkick Murphys material, so I have no idea how this compares to the rest of it. I thought it was pretty fun. I imagine there might be better albums in their back catalogue. There was parts of this which felt a bit forgettable at times. Yeah,
I wouldn't say this is one of the best albums they've ever put out. I think some of the earlier stuff, there's also a bit like harder and heavier. This was, although there was, it was quite raucous, it wasn't as much of a sort of street punk or riot punk enthused album as some of the previous ones. Like, my favourite ones of theirs are probably Blackout or The Meanest of Times, are sort of their best albums, which seem to be faster, heavier, and angrier. I don't know if their sound is sort of changing as they go along. I guess it's good to not just do the same thing over and over, especially now they're on their 9th album. Didn't realise there were that many, actually.
Yeah, it's a good sort of quiet intro. I mean, to be fair, I'm, as I've said, a bit of a softer folk fan. It's possible I'd have found a more sort of loud, raucous, shouty album or screamy album a bit more off-putting, but I feel like it would be interesting, I always say this, to go back and find some of their more amazing albums. I don't know, what are the standout albums? What are the recognised classics?
My favourite is definitely The Meanest of Times. I highly recommend that. Blackout again, I mentioned, highly recommend that. Those are some of my favourites. There's one called Going Out in Style. That one's really, really good as well. The previous album they did to this was probably sounded more like a traditional Dropkick Murphys album, but it wasn't quite as good as some of their classics, but that's worth listening to. That one's called Signed and Sealed in Blood. Sing Loud, Sing Proud is really good.
Have you named all of them yet?
No, there's 9. There's still about another 4 or 5. If you want a sort of vintage Dropkick, I say go to like Blackout or The Meanest of Times. I mean, this album, it's got all the hallmarks of the sort of Dropkick Murphys. You know, they can be quite folky at times. Like, there's obviously a lot of like, as well as the sort of guitars and stuff, there's a lot of like bagpipes, penny whistles, accordions, things like that. Like the opening track, The Lonely Boatman, which is just without lyrics. It's got vocals but no lyrics, and like a big sort of folky introduction. And I like that. That was quite a good song. It really shows all their folk influences. Again, there's a very folky opening to 4:15:13.
Yeah.
This album also showed that, you know, they can be quite light-hearted and do write songs that can be on, for, you know, sort of an angry, aggressive band. They do write songs that can be on like the silly side. Like, I really like that one called, something like, I think it's just called the Hat Song, or
I Had a Hat.
Yeah, I Had a Hat, that was it. But the guy just constantly arguing that he had a hat when he came into this party and you have a hat when he goes out. And it made me laugh. And it goes to show that they can be humorous as well as sort of aggressive and serious.
And First Class Loser, which was just a bit silly.
Yeah, and that song as well, yeah.
But yeah, it was okay. I suspect my level of folk punk is probably more Levellers and Pogues than this, but it's good fun.
We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when. We all had a good time and we're sad to see it end. Good luck be with you, you go your way, I'll go mine. So until the next time, it's farewell and not goodbye.
Okay, and lastly this fortnight, we'll be talking about my recommendation from the previous episode, which was the 1995 version of Richard III, directed by Richard Loncraine, and starring Ian McKellen as the titular Richard III, alongside a range of people you probably recognise, including Jim Broadbent, Robert Downey Jr., Nigel Hawthorne, Kristin Scott Thomas, Maggie Smith, Dominic West. Yeah, this particular version sets the story in a sort of 30s Britain, where it appears that fascism rose here rather than in Germany, which is nice. Courtesy of course, Richard III, who, as in the original play, murders his way to the crown by killing off everyone in his way, anyone who he thinks might get in his way, anyone who expresses the slight possible intention of one day getting in his way at some point in the future. Yeah, like all good sort of tragic Shakespearean villains, his desire for murder spirals out of control quite quickly. Ian McKellen, of course, doing one of his big Shakespearean performances. This is, I think, one of his big prominent roles before he became, of course, internationally well known as Magneto. And, of course, Gandalf. He was Gandalf, wasn't he?
Yes, and he also won an Oscar for Gods and Monsters.
But yeah, this was a big one. I saw this at school, I saw this at university, I saw this the other week. I thought it was pretty good all of those times. Alastair, what did you think?
Yeah, I really enjoyed watching it. As you said, it's a famous, like, iconic rendering of Richard III, and it is what made Ian McKellen's name internationally, I think, through the theatre production of this play, which used the Nazi iconography, and then this film. It's really, really good, mainly because Ian McKellen is brilliant in the title role. He's a very gifted actor and really good with this material, and he does the character so well, and he's a difficult character to describe because he's in some ways a bit of a tyrant and a bully, but he's also sort of weak and vulnerable and sort of conniving, and how he sort of twists and manipulate his way to gain what he wants by playing people off against each other and then killing them.
I mean, it's quite a sort of classic character, but obviously he's been bullied horribly and has responded to that by becoming the biggest possible bully himself. He's just become bitter and he spits all his lines and he takes this sort of ridiculous glee in it all.
Yeah, and he is quite terrifying, that you can tell that he's like fanatical in his belief in himself and in his desire for power, and nothing will get in his way. And he really does portray the sort of, the hatred and the anger and the sort of intensity of Richard III, or at least the character as it was written by Shakespeare. And I thought, Ian McKellen is just just brilliant in this role, and you can see why it made him such a star. Yeah, and it's a great production. I mean, I don't know what it was like on the stage because I didn't see it, but they've certainly brought all the sort of visual spectacles cinema to this. They've not just pointed a camera at the stage production. There's like big spectacles, battles, rallies.
It's a pretty epic story. It's a very easy one to make cinematic. And they did do a good job, an impressively on-the-nose job of really visualising those Nazi comparisons. Like when the massive red and black banners drop when he
becomes king,
finally takes the crown. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's the huge rally he has when he proclaims that he is the King of England. Yeah, they really do get the Nazi comparison. That works really well because it is a very British vision of Nazism. What's interesting is that in Germany, Nazism kind of rose from the bottom of society up. It was a kind of revolt organised by the poorer people against the establishment. Whereas I think, was it George Orwell that said that if fascism spread in Britain, it would be fascism from the upper class? Because we're very deferent to our social betters. It's kind of built into the fabric of British society. Certainly, like sort of before the 1960s and the sort of end of the Age of Reverence. But obviously kind of people with this sort of the gentry and the aristocracy are the ones that have the most to gain from a viciously hierarchical system. So if fascism or Nazism was ever to take over Britain, it would come from the wealthy and the landed aristocracy. And it kind of gets that across very well.
That's kind of depressing, isn't it? It combines what matters into this sort of microcosm of just the sort of the gentry and the royalty and the aristocracy. So rather than the revolution rising from the bottom of the people, it rises from the bottom of the upper class.
Yeah, it's like an internal power struggle within the wealthy of one kind of set of bourgeois trying to drive out another set. But it is kind of, because as well as having all like the Nazi iconography in this film, it also weaves in like there's a lot of the pageantry of royalty and the aristocracy, which comes from the Shakespeare play. But also I think it works really well as a portrait of what a Nazi British society would look like, whereas the Nazi Germany was ruled by like generals and party, whereas a Nazi Britain would still be ruled by dukes and counts and kings and princes. They just adopt the iconography and the rigid discipline of fascism. So yeah. I think it portrays that really well, that kind of how British this is, and which works well with the Shakespeare, the fact that all these characters are like Duke of Buckingham or Prince of Wales and stuff, and that kind of makes sense. That really makes sense in the context of like a British vision of Nazism.
Even though it's like obviously not historically accurate, because I think by the 30s we were at the point where power, as in actual active political power, had mostly transferred from the royalty to the politicians, hadn't it?
Yes, that is the case, but that's why people were worried about fascism, because if the upper class were going to make a grab to wrestle power back, it would be in the guise of fascism or Nazism. Yes, power, the 1930s, rested very much with Parliament. But that doesn't mean the aristocracy were without influence. And if they were to sweep away Parliament, that's the sort of model they would adopt. And fascism was very popular with the aristocracy in the 1930s. That's where it found its support in Britain.
I mean, obviously the story of this guy killing his way to the crown is quite a sort of straightforward, appealing, iconic story. But the more modern, current, contemporary of that is probably House of Cards. I mean, this is basically a royal version of House of Cards. Obviously, not really, because it came first by several centuries, but adapted more firmly to our times because it's about a politician killing his way to the top.
Yeah, and I think it's a very iconic story. That the rise of the power mad individual is an iconic story that's been told throughout history. This is a great telling of it. House of Cards is like another telling of it. It's a theme that we sort of writers return to.
But yeah, House of Cards had like Ian Richardson in the British one and Kevin Spacey in the American one. And the theme is they're both quite sort of smooth and charming in a sort of wry, dark way. Whereas Richard III, I mean, he's sort of magnetic because he's played by Ian McKellen, but he's not smooth and charming. If anything, his attempts to be smooth and charming are part of how McKellen makes him even creepier.
And also I guess he's in a different system, a system that responds well to brute force, which is what he employs. And he recruits various people from servants and stuff to be his kind of enforcers who do the nastiness.
Yeah.
Speaking of, I really liked how they used modern London. So they used Thameside Power Station as a cover for the Tower of London, which is quite good because it sits on the River Thames, just like the Tower of London, but in this kind of 30s modernist vision of Shakespeare. That's where the tower is, and that's where people are imprisoned. And that's also where they, I'm pretty sure they shot the big sort of rally scene when he gets crowned. People in London now will know Thameside Power Station as the Tate Modern, which moved in there, I think, a few years after this was shot. And then the final battle takes place at Battersea Power Station, again, another sort of modernist building in London. That's where that's where Richard makes his final stand, and that's what covers for Bosworth Battlefield in the original play.
Yeah, I like the way they actually did put on a full, like, massive action scene at the end, complete with, like, the inevitable man-to-man showdown at a high place.
Yeah.
Properly turned this into an action film. I appreciate that.
Yeah, they use the full scope of sort of cinema to bring the spectacle. And there's a huge scene, like train-based scene when they're kind of, and there's lots of scenes of like them getting their armies together and tanks and jeeps and things.
Yeah, I was happy to see this stood up. I remember particularly when I saw it doing my university module on Richard III. On Shakespearean film. I absolutely loved it. I thought this was by far one of the most appealing and cinematic and good adaptations, alongside the Baz Luhrmann Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, we watched that a lot in GCSE drama. Our GCSE drama teacher's approach to teaching the subject was just to stick us in front of that film.
Yeah, no, I don't think we saw it at school. I think I might have been in secondary school slightly too early to have that film on tap.
It was also because around the same time there was the Kenneth Branagh TV adaptations of a lot of Shakespeare plays. It's an interesting thing I've discussed with people in the past, which is like kind of when is the ideal time period or way to adapt Shakespeare. The Kenneth Branagh ones opted for a sort of vaguely Edwardian vibe. Obviously this one is a sort of 1930s. Well, the 1930s it isn't quite the real 1930s, but drawing on that. And I think you have to choose your period right. I've seen a lot of ones updating Shakespeare to like 21st century. And usually like setting things like Macbeth in a company or like, you know, King Lear in a nightclub or whatever. But it doesn't work, and it just seems a bit daft. And the reason I think is because Shakespeare was written in the sort of early modern period, and a lot of the plays are set in medieval times or in the ancient world. The rigid social hierarchy is a really important aspect of Shakespeare. So if you set it in a sort of contemporary setting, when we don't have these as rigid social hierarchies, it can seem a bit odd, like why people like sort of have these kind of authority or hold over the people.
Fine, I'll drop my screenplay of Hamlet set at a social media startup.
It would be to post or not to post.
What should we do about all the abuse? I can't decide. Let's do nothing. Actually, can't think of it. This is amazing.
Yeah, well, that's great. Right, go write that.
If nothing else, there's at least a tweet in that, I feel.
Yeah. So sometimes these modern adaptations just lose that kind of hierarchical class nature. That's why the Edwardian ones, the Kenneth Branagh Edwardian ones work really well. That's why obviously setting it in medieval or the early modern period works, because that's when they were written. And this one works really well, again, because the 1930s had that, and a sort of Nazi state has, you know, social hierarchies even more strictly enforced. So it really works as a Shakespeare adaptation in that way.
I mean, that's not making a decision about Shakespeare adaptations as a whole, though. That's just making the parallels between this play specifically and the 1930s.
Yeah, but I think it also works as in the broader question of what period should you update Shakespeare to if you're gonna not set it in like a medieval period. You need to think about things like how are the power structures going to come across. And in a Nazi society, yes, it makes perfect sense and works really well. Like set in a nightclub, probably not going to work. The exception to the present day one is setting Shakespeare in schools, which works really well because teenagers are very hierarchical, and social hierarchy is very important to teenagers. So that's why things like 10 Things I Hate About You work really well.
I haven't seen that film. It's one of the classic films I've never seen.
In that film, they do the Taming of a Shrew set in a high school, and it works really well.
I can imagine that. I'm assuming they don't keep the Shakespearean dialogue.
They keep some of it. They use bits of it here and there. Yeah, unlike the Richard III, which we just saw, is the play verbatim. I think they may have edited it down a bit.
I think it's only an hour and a half. Yeah, they've clearly edited it down. But yeah, all the text is straight from the play.
Yeah, whereas in 10 Things I Hate About You, they do update a lot of it. Obviously, they use modern vernacular. But there are bits, they drop in where they can. They're quite clever about putting in bits of the dialogue. There's two supporting characters who are the kind of, I think the two people who do a lot of the scheming and the kind of setting up of the misunderstandings that kind of form the basis of a lot of Shakespeare's comedies. The two characters that kind of inhabit that role, who have a sort of bantery high school relationship, do use a lot more Shakespeare lines. And also a lot of Shakespeare has made it into modern parlance, which helps it work as well. Like, for example, when someone says, like, "Sir, the lady doth protest too much." Well, people say that now, even though it was from a play. Like Richard III, again, opens with, "Now is the winter of our discontent," which again has made it into the modern vernacular.
Yeah, mostly in the form of that discount tense joke.
Yeah, there's that, yeah. No, it's the winter or discontent.
I enjoyed Robert Downey Jr. as the brash American.
That was quite early in his career, wasn't it? Because this is 1995, so yeah, it was an early Robert Downey Jr.
And of course, it's a comparatively small part, but because he's Robert Downey Jr., his face is massive on the poster.
Yeah, and also he's very good, I thought, in his role. He did his part well.
Oh yeah, he was great.
I thought Jim Broadbent was really good as Duke of Buckingham, who's kind of the person who feeds other people to the crocodile and then starts to wonder at what point it's going to turn on him.
It's fun seeing Jim Broadbent playing evil. I haven't seen it that often.
Yeah, and Dominic West, which we know from The Wire. This must have been, again, an early outing for him.
I think so. He looks pretty young. I guess probably only a few years before he got The Wire, but yeah. And I liked the ominous stop on his face at the end to suggest he too might be more evil than he seems.
Yeah, that's where the history picks up, I suppose.
Predictably, I don't know the history well enough to know whether the Dominic West character does turn out to be a twat, but
well, I think
there's certainly heavy implication.
Yeah, well, I guess the kind of sort of the bloodshed of history continues.
He's the future King Henry VII.
Yeah, he becomes Henry VII. Yeah, he's the Earl of Richmond, and then he's crowned King Henry VII. His son was Henry VIII, who was a bit of a tyrant, killed a lot of people.
Nice.
From thenceforth history. And thus endeth the lesson.
Okay, so that was Richard III. Bit of Shakespeare, bit of raising the tone. Alastair, what have you got for next time?
For next time, I've got a recommendation for you that's a TV show. It's an unusual TV show, to put it mildly. It's a bit of it's a very odd show. I'm going to recommend you watch Lars von Trier's hospital set horror TV show Kingdom.
Okay.
If you know Lars von Trier as a director, he makes very unusual, usually quite confrontational films. And this is one of the first things that brought him to wider attention, along with films at the time like Breaking the Waves. It's a very good TV show. It's very scary. It's very, very strange. And I hope you enjoy it.
I wait to see it with interest. You've spoken about this before. It sounds terrifying.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll find out next episode how scared you were. I hope I haven't overhyped it.
Alright, that's all the Moderate Fantasy Violence for today. Thank you for listening. As ever, if you've enjoyed the show, you can follow us on Twitter as @MFV Podcast, where we occasionally comment on the podcast, pop culture, and combinations of the above. And we're also on Facebook if you just search for Moderate Fantasy Violence and look for our lovely purple logo. And you can subscribe on iTunes, and if you're subscribed on iTunes and are enjoying the show, then we implore you to leave a review, as it does help us find other listeners.
You can also find us on our website, which is moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can listen to all our previous episodes, our bonus excessive fantasy violence clips, and you can read various bits of writing from Nick and myself. I've been Alastair Ball. You can follow me on Twitter @AlastairJRBall, and you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
And I've been Nick Bryan. You can find me on Twitter as @NickMB, and you can find some sundry blogging and details of my self-published crime books at nickbryan.com. Okay, and that really is it for this episode. We'll see you next time, when we'll be talking about the eagerly anticipated Lego Batman movie, which I think has potential to be the best cinema Batman of the last couple of years, plus the new X-Men show Legion, and British film sequel Trainspotting 2, or T2 Trainspotting as I think it's called. And I'll be taking a look at Alastair's recommendation, Kingdom. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, no, it's annoyingly hard to get hold of. We watched it on a German DVD that I bought years and years ago, which was annoyingly hard to get the subtitles to disappear from. Did you manage it?
I had to watch it with German subtitles in the end, but I didn't find it distracting at all.
Yeah, fair enough. I played it on my computer on VLC, which has a central subtitle control. Anyway, this probably isn't that interesting to the listeners. Although, for the record, yeah, if you ever want to take subtitles off a DVD, it's worth giving VLC a go, if you're willing to watch DVDs on your computer.
My computer's so new it doesn't have a DVD drive.
What is this bullshit?